All right, fossil fuels, nuclear fission, hydroelectric, those are your three main resource power usages that are out there. Your fossil fuels, the one big way to tell if something is a renewable or non-renewable, it'll always tell you if it's non-renewable or not, is where does it come from. If it comes from the ground, then in the crust of the earth, then it is a non-renewable resource. It was formed over many millions of years of time, and therefore now technically you could say that it's renewable in a million years or so, but that's not the same. It's got to be practical time, usage time. So if you use this up, it's gone for good. So that is correct, group 7. Group 8, now this is not really what I was looking for uses, but I'll allow you to tell me, if you can tell me one other use like transportation, which is correct by the way, besides transportation, then I'll go ahead and give you the point for it. I'll just call it transportation. I mentioned there's transportation and two other things that are your main energy resource usage. If you could come up with one of those other two that these might be used for. So fossil fuels, gasoline is used in transportation to power your car, for example. So these are, you listed out all the fossil fuels, but so do you have anything group 8? Is there anything you can tell me that this is used for, gasoline, coal? So, for example, gasoline we know is used for transportation. So, some besides transportation.
Can you put it?
Pardon me?
Can you cook?
Very good. Cooking.
Eating.
Cooking and eating we usually put together. Cooking's a big thing.
Yeah, you can eat cool.
A lot of people in China, they don't do this here because the amount of air pollution it creates is terrible. But in China, they have they have an abundance of coal, first of all, cooking, heating, transportation, and electricity. So those are your big three that these energy resources are used for, and those are used for those particular ones. Environmental impact, there's a lot of them. I'm not going to list them all out here. CO2 emissions is one of them. CO2 emissions is kind of different from the other things, but we'll also put some of the other emissions that are up there. SOx and NOx. I don't know if you remember these, but when we talked about the different mineral cycles, sulfur and nitrogens were part of those mineral cycles, and these substances contribute to acid rain, so that is one of the other environmental impacts. And impacts of mining. So we've already talked about the kind of impacts that mining of minerals and things like that has on the earth. Coal is the most mined mineral. So in all this stuff we talked about, habitat destruction, runoff, acid runoff, all those kind of things we talked about. We talked about mineral resources just recently. That's going to be, of course, associated with coal as well. When they drill wells, it is considered mining also. So that actually they have a bad rap because you always see the birds coated in oil and stuff like that. But wells are actually lower in impact on the environment than an open strip mine, like for coal, etc. Of course, they're for two different things because petroleum and natural gas, of course, are liquid and gas, respectively. So you can put a pipe down to get those, but there's also problems that happens with that, with the leaks and things like that. And that would be another thing. Let's see, SOx and NOx from burning it. Contamination from leaks. That includes spills. Now you see a lot of the big news events. Like, do you guys remember Deepwater Horizon? Not the movie, although the movie is based on true, so you remember from that. You guys know what I'm talking about? The oil leak. What was that like?
It's only 2007 or 8.
The BP.
Yeah, the BP in the Gulf, right? That was the Deepwater Horizon. So that got a lot of press. You know, it kept pumping out underwater, looked horrible. You know, you figure all this oil, etc., going into the Gulf. That's terrible, which it is. But you know, there is much more oil every day that in small amounts is spilled off. A lot of it's on land. It gets. We're going to learn about this when we look at water pollution. A lot of it gets washed off into the ocean, into lakes and ponds and things like that. And a lot of times you also have the problem with it soaks down into the aquifer. Now a lot of things are filtered out, pollutants, when they soak down the aquifer. Oil and other things like that is not, because it's things don't break it down. So that's a big problem, has been a big problem from the use of fossil fuels, in particular petroleum products. So we'll look at that a lot more in detail, like I said, when we look at the pollution unit, but those are some of the many things and environmental impacts that we get from fossil fuels. All right, so nuclear fission is, we're going to just say electrical power. I'm guessing most of you do not have a uranium-235 stove at home, right? Am I right? None of you throw a couple of pellets of plutonium into a pot of water and that kind of thing, you know. You could put transportation. Anybody know the very limited use of nuclear power for transportation?
Submarine.
Nuclear submarines, yes. So that's it. And really the only reason, the main reason why nuclear power is used in subs is not because it's, you know, such a great system and everything. They have to put a lot of shielding, which puts a lot of weight on the sub, but it's because it doesn't need oxygen. So, you know, that's a big problem with burning, you know, fuels and stuff like that to run a sub. They couldn't stay down for long. They had to come up and snorkel to get enough power and store up enough air to run the engines and stuff. So anyway, we're just going to stick with electrical power. Excuse me. Electrical power. And it is not renewable, because where does uranium come from?
Big ground.
It goes from the ground. It comes from the crust of the earth. There's a limited supply of it. Now, one thing about uranium, it's not considered to be really in short supply. It takes so little of it to actually produce power that we don't look at it the same way we look at the fossil fuels, which, you know, they're millions and billions of tons of each of those is used on an everyday basis, and in many areas they're running out of it. So radioactive waste is the #1 problem with nuclear power, so that's very good, group 6. And you have mining impacts, of course. So of course, if you're mining for uranium, and the ore that is found is called pitchblende. But if you're mining for uranium, and we've already learned about the fact that mining, when you bring up all that stuff to the surface and the rain washes it out into lakes and ponds and all over the place, or in the air, and gets spread around by the wind, that's obviously going to be a bad thing to have radioactive material floating around, etc. Once again, unfortunately, you don't need very much of it to run a nuclear power plant, and so they don't have to mine a lot of it, but still, that's going to be a big one there. Radioactive waste, and very rare chance of meltdown. When I say rare, that's really on record, as far as we know, that you can detect these things. Only happened once. Anybody know where the one case of a major meltdown, or meltdown to the point where people's lives... Well, now, 3 Mile Island is not the correct answer, but that was actually not a meltdown. That was a release of radioactive gas, and that happened in Pennsylvania. But this one was not in the United States. Chernobyl is the answer for that one. So that happened in what is...
Well, there's also the one that happened in Japan recently.
From the earthquake, or from the... Yeah, that wasn't a meltdown. That was release of... I mean, that's a good point. And that actually, this is what was released there, was radioactive waste, and the waste holding pits and everything flooded, and that washed out and everything, and that's what the problem was there. Fortunately, because the waste is bad, but it's not nearly as bad as having active, high-powered fuel exposed, and kind of exposed getting out of the environment, and things like that, like happened in Chernobyl and just spread all over Eastern Europe and West Asia. Alrighty, so those are big ones there. Hydroelectric dam, can you group 4 be a little bit more specific? This is how you utilize hydroelectric power usually, but what is a use of hydroelectric power? What does it do? I've given you the 3 already. Anybody in group 4?
Can you say that again?
So, dam is not a use for nuclear power, or for hydroelectric power. What is it used for?
Transportation. Electric.
Hydroelectric power used for transportation.
To power like
Steamboats.
buildings and stuff.
Power buildings and stuff. In what way?
Gives them electricity.
Thank you. Yeah, I really went out on a limb for you guys for that. Pretty much all. And notice it does say hydroelectric. Transportation is not that far off. Listen, transportation is not that far off because transportation is an energy resource of water. Whenever people for thousands of years have gotten on a boat and taken that boat downstream and not had to use any energy to do so, they were utilizing the energy of that river. So that is technically a transportation use of water as an energy resource. So you can't negate that. But when we say hydroelectric, that of course is a whole different thing. And yeah, electrical energy, as the name implies. Okay, and power energy, same thing. And environmental impacts.
Dams.
Yeah, well, dam does cause that, but what that does is river habitat destruction.
Oh, yeah.
Possible flooding.
Well, it floods upstream. So what happens when you put a dam up is that normally you have a stream of water that's flowing down like that. And the reason why I use a dam for hydroelectric power is because it channels all of that energy so you can capture the whole power of the river. Now you can also utilize hydropower with an open, like a mill, the old-fashioned mill kind of thing. And sometimes they use that because it's much less environmentally impactful. Have you ever been to the restaurant where you make your own pancakes?
The old Spanish.
The old Spanish mill or
De
something,
Leon
like that. Anyway, it's a De Leon Springs. But they've got one they're using the spring. They use the spring power, and that's actually an old historic thing, which is cool enough as it is. But that pushes a paddle wheel, and like I said, they've used that for thousands of years. Probably people have done that. But so when you put a dam up, that can harness all that. You can produce quite a bit of energy. The Hoover Dam, biggest dam in the United States, used to be the biggest dam in the world. Now China's got a bigger one, but that powers several states. I don't know. It's a lot. It's a huge amount of energy that's generated. But it floods upstream. So you're basically putting a wall up on a river. So you can imagine the water that's upstream from it coming down is going to pile up behind it. And then downstream it'll drop down. So dams have been used for a long time, not just to create power, but also to make a dry area in the floodland area of a river, and also to create a water reservoir behind it. There's an Aswan Dam on the Nile River, big dam on the Nile River, and it was made mainly so they'll have a reservoir of water, so they'll have a constant water supply there, which they can water their crops and stuff with. It also caused a bunch of problems, so we'll talk about that later. So anyway, the river habitat is completely destroyed on both sides, basically completely altered, you could say. I mean, stuff can grow back, and nature adapts, and that kind of thing. But it's a completely different habitat than when it was not dammed. You have an interruption of sediment. And this relates back to what we talked about floodplains and stuff. The last time we talked about water resources and soil resources. And that one of the reasons why people settled in floodplains, Egyptians, Mesopotamians, etc., was because they're very fertile, because the water comes down out of the mountains and it's got all this sand and mud and silt and stuff like that in it. That's full of minerals. Then it floods out. The normal thing for it to do is to flood out seasonally when it's either snow melts or you get a lot of rainy season, whatever, and go over the shores. And then when it recedes, when it gets dried up, it gets drier season, the dirt and everything that's left behind is very fertile. Well, a dam, of course, will interrupt that process. So that and that's actually what has happened a lot of times in the past. They've had a lot of, well, not a lot, but there have been many instances where dams collapsed and then people had built their homes and their farms and everything in front of them downstream because it was now dry and it's got good farming water and that kind of thing. And of course they got flooded out and killed and things like that. But because that sediment, when it builds up, actually adds weight on the wall of that dam, and it'll collapse. So they have processes and things like that that help to reduce that now, but it still interrupts that natural flow of sedimentation, the whole rock cycle. This is all important for soil and all that other kind of stuff. So that's a problem. And then another thing it does is it interrupts spawning species. So there's a number of species, including salmon, that are born up in the mountains. The water there, the higher up you get, the less minerals, therefore the less life, therefore the less predators. So it's kind of a safe place to have your babies. And they hatch, and then they swim down to the ocean and live their lives out as adults in the ocean. And then the adults will then swim back upstream and lay their eggs. And a lot of them die. The salmon die right after they do that. They lay their eggs, fertilize their external fertilizer. So the female lays the eggs, the male fertilizes it, then they die. And then the babies basically live off their dead parents. Yum. And then they, once they're strong enough, they swim downstream to go back out in the ocean and do it all over again. Okay. So obviously, if you have a dam in the way, then that's a problem. And so they have some things called fish ladders. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute that help to alleviate that. But it's still a problem, and you've seen actually, in particular in Canada, there's it's called the James Bay Project, where they just basically set about damming up a lot of the rivers to get the energy from them, and the salmon population went down by like 70%. I don't think it's ever recovered from there. And that's a problem, obviously, environmentally speaking, but that's also a problem for fishermen. I mean, salmon's a popular food. So there's a lot of different aspects that can happen to that. So, hydroelectric, it is, as we'll see, it's clean. There's neither one of these, you'll notice, no pollution from them, because you don't burn anything. So you get a lot of air pollution and stuff like that from the fossil fuels. You don't get that with nuclear. You don't get that also with hydroelectric power. But there's other environmental impacts that they have right there as well. Fossil fuels at this point, the only really practical ones to use for transportation, and that's your biggest in industrialized nations, like the United States. That's the biggest use of fossil fuels, is the gasoline that's powering automobiles, gasoline and diesel that's powering automobiles and trucks. That's changing, of course. Thank you, Mr. What's his name? Tesla guy.
Elon Musk.
Thank you. And all the people that have innovated in that particular area. I personally don't. I think that we'll talk about this later. I don't think we do alternative energy. Come on now. But the battery, the rechargeable battery, I don't think is the way to go. I think we're going to go to hydrogen fuel cells. So, but anyway, we'll talk about that and what the hydrogen economy is and everything when we talk about alternative energy. Any questions about the table here?